So it's 2023. Nephilim GT pack's about to go. So I basically wanted to make a tier list to talk about the best performing units from the Custodes faction. To do that, I basically compiled the top performing lists, which is just lists that had a maximum of 1 loss. So, 4-1, 5-1, 5-0, and this is all at GT or major events. And I basically counted the frequency of lists that had a particular unit. So, for example, if there's 20 high-performing Custodes lists and the Galatus is in all 20 of them, it's obviously an S tier unit. Or if the Galatus is in like one list, I'd put it in C tier because there's a conceivable reason to use it, but it's not particularly common and it's probably not particularly good. So that's my method. Obviously, some of my own opinions are going to come into play because there's going to be units that you're effectively forced to take, like Custodian Guard and maybe even things like Prosecutors. They're going to show up on a lot of lists. That doesn't particularly mean that they're great. So that's when my own opinion is going to come into play. I'll just go in the order that the website gives me here. So starting off, we have the Achillus, and we're starting off hot. So we're going to put the Achillus in S tier. From when I looked at the data, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, and there hasn't been that many events over the past 2 weeks, so it's still quite accurate. The Achillus was in 13 of the 20 top performing lists, so over 50%. It's around 2/3 of lists. It's very good. Gonna put it in S tier. I think that part of the reason why it's so common and it's the most commonly used dreadnought variant is just because it's very nice to have something that does a minimum of 4 damage, has plenty of attacks. It's reasonably durable. It's not even that expensive. It's 170 points at its most sort of stock loadout. You don't mind just running it into something. It probably kills it if it's like a vehicle or a monster, and then it dies, and that's totally fine. You don't care. It does that. It does that very well. It's core. It gets all the buffs from Trajann and other characters, so he's an S tier. He's great. So this is, I think this is a Leia. I don't think this is the generic Knight-centura. I've never seen this model used in a competitive game, so we're just going to put it in the stop tier. I'm not even really going to talk about it. All right, Valoris terminators. We're going to put these in B tier, so roughly 25% of the time they're in lists. Usually they're in individual units, so just units of a single model. I think I saw one list that did well where they took a unit of 4 or 5, and it was a kind of skew horde type list. They're good for scoring behind enemy lines. They open up your secondaries. They let you have an option, because sometimes there's missions where there's just no good secondaries, and having 1 or 2 individual Alaris opens up behind enemy lines, and it's very nice. So we're gonna put them in B, and we're gonna move on. Aquilon. I'm going to put them in C. I don't think they showed up in any lists, but, they're not completely horrible. They're just overpriced. There's kind of a reason to use them if you really, really want their strength 10 attacks, or even just volume of attacks with rerolls from their claws. They're not really good, but they're not so bad that I'd put them in the bottom tier. The flyer, I think this is the transport one. I don't really care. It's good. You can't even deploy it on some boards. I never see it in lists that perform well, so I'm just gonna put it in stop tier. All right, Mr. Bike Captain, definitely an S tier. I'm even gonna put it above the Achillus dreadnought. It shows up very often. It's 70% of lists that perform will have a Bike Captain. He's great. He takes warlord traits and relics and just does magic with them. You give him tip of the spear. He's super consistent. He's also a mobile source of rerolls, because obviously Trajan's great, but he sometimes can't keep up with the rest of the army. Even like dreadnoughts and bikers and stuff will outpace him, so it's nice to have a more mobile source of the rerolls 1 to hit. And yeah, he's a beast. You give him Superior Curation, you can give him Radiant Mantle for -1 to hit if you really want. And he's awesome. So we're going to put him in S tier. Very common. Blade Champion. He's kind of fringe B or A. I'm actually going to go with A, just because he offers something kind of unique, which is a slight movement buff in the form of the +1 to charge if he is already in engagement range of a unit. And he has a 3 damage profile on his weapon, which is very, very nice, especially now with a lot of armies having 3 health elite infantry. I think the Blade Champion is great, and we're going to put him in A tier. As far as how often he showed up in 6 lists, I believe, so that's around 30% of the time there's a Blade Champion in a list, which isn't super high, but there's also a ton of characters in the Custodes book, so I still think he's fairly relevant and has a place. Alright, the Caladius. I think you could debate putting this in S or A tier. I'm going to put it in A tier. I think that on WTC boards or like European style terrain where it's just a bunch of like obscuring L ruins, it's an S tier for sure. But on US Open, it's significantly worse. There's sometimes entire games where your opponent doesn't really need to expose a lot of their army. They can just hide, they can just castle behind the gigantic ruins, and the Caladius will, even though it's really fast and has fly, it'll just never get an angle on anything super significant. You're not going to see something unless your opponent wants you to see it. So I'm going to put it in A. I think it showed up in roughly 50% of lists. Yeah, not 9 lists out of 20, so 45%. It's great. I mean, 14 inches and fly is crazy, but it's just, you don't need it to win, obviously. I mean, half of these really good lists didn't even use it. So it's great, but it's not mandatory, and I think it's very terrain dependent on whether or not you're going to have success with it or not. I think this is so this is just a captain, the regular captain. I'm going to put him in C tier, so he's not bad. Actually, I'll put him above the Terminators because he can advance and charge. I think that's the only way to run him. Particularly in Dreadhouse, you can make him advance and charge with a 3 damage weapon. That's really strong. But then you're playing Dreadhouse and you run into a Mortal Wound army and you lose immediately. So that's not great. But I think he showed up maybe 1 or 2 times in lists, but I don't really rate him very highly. There's just so many. I think every other HQ option is basically better in terms of like the generic characters. So we'll put him in C tier. Next, I don't know what this is. This is like some kind of a transport. We're playing an army where you pay a ton of points to be durable, so paying even more points to go in a transport just seems kind of silly, so we're not going to talk about that. Alright, the generic Contemptor. I'm going to put this in A tier above the Blade Champion. So the generic Contemptor is more of a recent meta thing, I would say. He's only in 20% of lists, but when he does show up, he's often taken in triples, so you just take 3 with multi-multis, you just surround Trajann with them. And especially in Emperor's Chosen, they just become an extremely reliable shooting platform because you're hitting on 2s, you're rerolling from Trajann, you're probably wounding on 2s or 3s, and then if you roll a 1, Trajann lets you reroll that, and then if you roll a 2, you Emperor's Chosen that one, and, you know, very consistently, every dreadnought results in you handing your opponent 2 multi-multi saves. So, quite good. I think that, if anything, we're going to see more of these, so that's why I'm going to put it in the A tier, even though we haven't seen a ton of it yet. I do think it's strong. All right, we're continuing with some pretty good units here. So the Galatus, going to put it below the Caladius because it shows up slightly less, so 8 lists instead of 9, which is around 40% of the time. The Galatus is pretty great. I mean, he has a 4-bin vuln. He's -1 to hit in melee. I think that the main reason why it's just not as popular as the Achillus is its role is kind of already done by other units in the army in the sense that it's this durable unit that gets kind of locked in combat and just eventually wins, but it takes a bit of time. So it's not super unique. He does have a 3 damage weapon, which is very nice, but it's only strength 7. So he definitely has a role, but I don't think you need to take it. So we're going to put it in A tier there. Next, we got the generic Custodians. Our troops choice here. We're going to put them in A tier below the Caladius. Obviously, they showed up plenty of time. I think they were probably in like, what, 75% of lists, it looks like. So 75% of lists took at least 1 unit of troops. But But the fact that some players feel the need to go to great lengths to not use them means I can't really justify putting them in S tier, because some people really don't want to use them that badly. That being said, I actually like them. I often take more than the minimum troops in Custodes lists, just because I think that Shield Guard are like a legitimately good unit, especially in the meta right now. Shield Guard are basically our only unit that can deal with flamers. Everything else, literally everything else, is just like horrible. Like mass AP2 just destroys our army. So something that can get a 2-up against that while standing in light terrain is very good. And we're going to put them in A tier there. Land Raider, it's the next unit. I'm not going to talk about it. Rhino, I'm not going to talk about it. This flyer, like, it's, you never see them. There's just no point to take them. So moving on, next, the Pallas grav-tank. I'm going to put this in C tier. I'm actually going to put it at the top. So the Pallas, it's basically the Custodes version of the Landspeeder Storm that Space Marine players use. So it's fast, it's cheap, it scores secondaries, it does like engage or behind enemy lines. Its gun is like fine. It's surprisingly durable for the points. It's under 100 points. It did show up in a couple lists, so there's a reason to use it. And, you know, sometimes with Custodes you make an army and you have kind of a weird number of points left, like 100. And that's a perfect time to just throw the Pallas in the list there. Okay, the next unit, Bikers. All right, so this one kind of surprised me, and I'm actually going to put Bikers at the very, very top here, the very best unit. Even with the nerfs, so, you know, a lot of strats don't work on them anymore. It just doesn't matter. The army needs a fast unit that counterattacks or even just alpha strikes and takes up a bunch of board space and threatens the opponent. The rest of the army is very slow. You know, dreads and 6-inch move infantry kind of just doesn't cut it if that's your whole army. And the data shows this. So 80% of lists that perform well have at least one unit of bikes. Many of those lists have 2 or 3 units of bikes. They're the most essential unit in the faction. So if we're looking at lists that win, bikes are the most commonly seen unit in those lists that perform well. So there we have it, bikes at the top there. Next, I can't really tell just by looking which sisters these are. I think these are Prosecutors. I'm going to put them in B. They're fine. They're just 60 point troops, right? So they put down a banner. They hang out every once in a while. You can use their deny strat, which comes in reasonably clutch. It's only 18-inch range, so your opponent can avoid it pretty easily. Their bonuses against demons is only 6-inch range, so that basically never comes up. If your opponent's within 6 inches of your Prosecutors, it's probably bad. It's probably bad news. But, you know, you see them very often. They're in a lot of lists. I think it's like, you know, 2/3 of the time. But, again, you really just take them because they're 60-point models, not because they do anything particularly useful. So we'll just leave them in B tier there. So this is the Knight-centura. I'm going to put the Knight-centura in C tier, and I'm actually going to put it above these other units, but below the grav-tank. So I think it showed up in at least one list. I don't know the exact number because I only sort of tracked the more commonly seen units. If I remember correctly, at least one list ran the removing OBSEC warlord trait on one of these ladies. And it's not bad. I mean, it does something unique, and you can kind of build around it in terms of your army. You can just maybe run lots of troops and run her to take off OBSEC. So there's a reason to use it, so I'll put her in C. Moving on, we have the Terminator captain. He was seen the same number of times as the Blade champion, but I'm going to put him in B. And the reason why is because, like, offensively, he does nothing unique. Defensively, you can take the Praetorian Plate Relic, you can teleport around and sort of help out, maybe on a certain flank where you think you need more support. But I don't know, I just find offensively he's really underwhelming, and he's basically just a tricky movement piece with the Praetorian Plate. I don't really see any other reason to use him. That alone is fine, and I'll put him in B tier because he still shows up like 25% of the time. But for me, the Blade champion just offers something a little bit more unique, where, you know, most players just run a bike captain and Trajann. So if you're doing something different, I feel like the Blade Champion offers something a little more unique and special than the Terminator Captain, so we're going to put the Terminator Captain in B. All right, next we have the Telemmon. The Telemmon's actually fine. I'm going to put it in B tier. It showed up in 4 lists, so roughly 20% of the time. I mean, he's a beast. He's T8. He has a 4-bin vuln, which is pretty rare as far as like vehicles go in the army. He has a 4 damage weapon. He's slow, but you don't really care. He'll hopefully get where he has to be eventually. So, yeah, I put him in B tier. I think taking 1 double fist Eternal Penitent is like totally legit and honestly probably pretty good. But the days of while we stand we fight and 3 Telemmons and just kind of playing really passively is over. So he's not seen nearly as often, but he's still fine. All right, the big man himself, Mr. Trajann. Gonna put Trajann actually below the bikes, but I'm gonna put him in S tier. So he's not seen in 100% of lists. He's actually only seen in 3/4 of lists, which is less than the bikes. But he's amazing. He even at 200 points, like you take him. The vast majority of the time, you want him in your list anyways. The fight twice is disgusting. He can just remove entire units from the board in one fight phase. He's like, I was gonna say he's deceptively durable, but he's just durable. Like, once your opponent's fought against Trajann once, they know exactly what he does. They won't even bother. Sometimes even if he's not being covered with Lookout Sir from other units, your opponents won't even bother shooting at him because he's gonna tank a bunch of invulns. He's gonna blanket damage, or he's gonna just spike his Feel No Pain. So he's awesome. We're gonna put him in S tier, but he's not taken literally all the time, whereas bikers are actually taken even more often than him. So we're gonna put bikers ahead of him. I'll do both Vexilus at the same time. So the Terminator Vex, I'll just put it in C because I just don't really see why you'd take the Terminator Vex over a regular one. You're just paying extra points, and you don't really want him to get locked in combat anyways, so the slight change in durability and attacks just won't really matter. And then the other Vex, for me, this is just a B tier unit. He's only in 25% of lists. I think you really need to skew to make it good. I think that the variant where you just surround him in Sagittarium is probably the best, and you take, your -1 to be hit, and then every unit within range of the aura also ignores cover with their attacks. That's probably the best way to do it. Maybe you can get away in the Contemptor spam list with taking the -1 to hit one as well, but it's just a lot of points on characters. It's very easy to overspend on characters in the Custodes army, I think. Even Trajann, the bike captain, like, feels pretty expensive. It's just under 400 points, and then once you take this guy, it's like, you're at 500. It really doesn't feel good. You need these other pieces like bikes and shield guard and like a Caladius tank or two. So I don't really love him. I don't actually take him very often, but in certain skill lists, there's you can make the argument. So I'll put him in B tier. Next, I think this is Valerian is his name. I'm gonna put him in C tier. I'm not gonna put him in the stop tier, only because he does something unique in he ignores phase capped damage, which phase cap damage rules just annihilate our faction in general. Like Catan and Abaddon, the Bloodthirsters are just a huge pain in the ass. So there's a reason to use him. I don't think it's really that justifiable, but he does something unique. So whatever, we'll put him in C tier. All right, Venatari. I'm gonna put Venatari below Prosecutors, but above the Telemmon. So they actually showed up slightly less often than the Telemmon, but I do think what they do is fairly useful in the sense that they're just 12-inch move infantry, and you can move and put a banner down or something on turn 1. Our secondaries are subpar with this faction, so anything that helps you accomplish secondaries is very nice. Venatari definitely do that. You don't need to go Conserve by turn 1 and just hope you make a long advance roll with a Custodian Guard unit to get an early banner down on some of those diagonal deployment maps. So they're pretty good. Yeah, we'll just leave them B tier. And all right, we only really have some stinkers to wrap up here. We're just gonna put these in stop tier. There's just no reason to use them. And then Wardens, I think you can make the argument that they go in stop tier too, but this just kind of looks prettier, so we'll do that. there's not really a reason to use wardens because of how bodyguard rules change. They don't just like permanently cover a character. They actually just count as extra models, but the whole entire Custodes army counts as extra models for Legotzer anyways, so it's very rare that their rule actually does anything, and then you're just paying for the ability to take axes, which I wouldn't even take axes anymore. I think spears are just better because you need the AP, and you get like an extra attack, but you're losing OBSEC. It's not really worth it. And yeah, that's all the units. So my big takeaways when I was making this are that bikes are just so important. Yes, they're expensive. Yes, not being able to use certain strats on them feels bad, but you just need something that moves really fast. You need something with the salvo launchers are very important. You need something to kind of threaten your opponent, or else it's very easy to just kind of pre-measure a Custodes player's charge ranges and just be like, all right, well, if I stay in here with all my shooting, I literally cannot be charged by dreadnoughts or just generic Custodian guard and the like. And that range isn't even very far unless you have bikes. So I think that's why they're so good. Trajan's a beast. The bike captain, I think everyone has recognized as sort of being the best HQ that isn't Trajann. He keeps up with the bikers. He gives them buffs. He is an absolute pain in the ass to kill. And then the Achillus, just high damage, right? It's something that isn't very expensive. You're not afraid of kind of throwing it away. He's only around the cost of 3 custodians with shields or whatever. He's just like 170 points. You charge him into something, he dies, he kills whatever he charges, and then you move on with your life and you're very happy. So yeah, those are the 4 best units. I think that anything in B tier or above, there's obviously a reason to use. It just might be, more of a skew list or some kind of interesting idea you're trying to pull off on the board. But yeah, thanks for watching, and take it easy. Hopefully Arcs of Omen gives us some changes. I think that Custodians are a strong army, but just for the sake of list variety, I think things like Terminators or Wardens or even Venatari could be changed a bit. But yeah, take it easy.